Hello there. Photographs of the American landscape have probably been one of the most dominant themes in world photography. There are a number of reasons why this has happened. Apart from the fact that in general photographers like to take pictures of dramatic scenery, America has for a long time supported their visual artists. This has resulted in their work being seen by the rest of the world. Most countries, or at least a lot of countries around the world, have not championed the arts, and therefore their photographs, and for the purposes of this video, their landscapes, are not as well known. Also, the US is such a vast, powerful and rich country with remarkable scenery. The pop culture and Hollywood have added to the worldwide awareness with the US landscape. Even Clint Eastwood westerns shot in Italy were thought to be American. Another important factor that contributes to making America photographically interesting is that the US terrain reflects changes in culture probably more than scenes from Europe. That's because the established European countries are beautiful in a way that the US isn't, but one gets the feeling that modern-day Europeans are living in a museum that more accurately reflects the former glory and power of those countries. One enduring sub-theme associated with American landscape photography has been the awareness of the environment, primarily how people have impacted on the land. For this discussion, I'm going to draw on a paper by Frank Mercado from the University of Colorado. I'll link it in the description. I'm going to track 3 influential photographers whose work is linked to specific periods within America's history, and also how their work has influenced major trends in landscape photography throughout the world.
Hey man,
I'm a guy who likes to work on my car.
The first photographer is William Henry Jackson. During the second half of the 19th century, the American social fabric was under enormous stress. The Civil War had wreaked havoc. There was rampant immigration, which put the cities under pressure. And a major financial panic occurred in 1873. This pressure on the establishment led to the famous call, "Go West, young man," which urged people to take advantage of the Homestead Act of 1862, which allowed citizens to lay claim to unoccupied pieces of land. And this announcement would have been pretty romantic as an idea at any time and in any place. But leaving the safety of cities wasn't for the faint-hearted. You had to contend with bandits, hostile tribes, and of course rattlesnakes. Jackson at times worked for the government survey teams and also for the railroads. He was commissioned to take images that would attract settlers to the West. He photographed the dramatic landscapes using the wet plate process, and his approach was straight documentary. What set him apart from his contemporaries was that he chose to show evidence of human development. His images often included railways and telephone lines and other structures. In this way, he was enticing the not-so-bold Easterners to consider making the move to the West. They could see that others had gone before them and paved the way for an easier journey for them. At the beginning, there was only a trickle heading west, but soon this turned into a flood. And it didn't take long for people to realize that the unspoiled beauty wasn't going to survive this surge. This growing voice of concern would eventually morph into the conservation movement. So even within Jackson's career, photography was being used as a weapon by those on the side of development as well as those pushing conservation. The next era that I want to talk about is the 1940s. After the Second World War, there was a major shift in the country's population demographics. Large number of people moved to the western states, causing a shift not only in the numbers, but also in wealth. That era was characterized by a migration towards suburban living, and this added to the pressure on the environment. More and more land was needed for housing and infrastructure. At that time, political and commercial interests allowed for almost unrestricted development and urban expansion. The conservation movement and photographers associated with it were looking for new ways to confront this threat. More of the same type of images wasn't really going to crack it, and they needed to come up with a different approach to break through the public's complacency. Ansel Adams and others started photographing the beauty of the Western American landscape in a manner that made people sit up and appreciate the grandeur of what they had inherited. In comparison with Jackson, Adams had technology on his side. The earlier photographers may have used even larger cameras than his 8x10, but he had the improved lenses, he had film, photographic paper, and the knowledge of the zone system. The depth of tones and clarity that he was able to achieve was incomparable with the earlier photographers' work. Unlike Jackson, Adams chose mainly to exclude the presence of humans. This accentuated the idea of the purity of nature and reinforced the push to preserve the environment. His work became popular with the general public through a new medium that was part of that time, the coffee table book. A few Ansel Adams books strategically placed on the lounge table was a great way to impress visitors with your sophisticated knowledge of contemporary photography, as well as the latest trends in conservation. This wide appreciation of Adams' work shifted photography into the mainstream art world. People were willing to go out of their way to view exhibitions of his work and buy his prints. I'm going to shift now to the 1970s and stick with Adams, but now it's Robert Adams who is central to the story. By this stage, the West didn't have many spaces left that matched the pristine beauty of Ansel Adams's images. Photographers who were alarmed by the urban sprawl and with its highways and billboards and crude architecture, they didn't relate to the imagery of the previous decades. They rebelled against the romanticism of Ansel Adams. And to say that their work was unromantic would be an understatement. Adams and others from what became known as the new topographic movement began to photograph in a way that could be described as straight photography because they were documenting their scenes directly. But they wanted to show the exploitation and degradation of the landscape, so they chose an aesthetic that was stripped down and spare. Robert Adams is the most widely known of all the new topographers, and his work probably best encapsulates their message. Their work as a whole bridged the gap between documentary photography and the conceptual art of the 60s and 70s, because it communicated a confusing mixture of beauty and ugliness. The famous 1975 New Topographics exhibition cemented their place in history. This style of photography spread quickly throughout the world. In 1984, the Data photographic mission commissioned 29 photographers from a variety of different backgrounds to document the French landscape. The traditional French picturesque photograph showing a line of trees leading up to a pretty church just didn't crack it in this selection. Rather, the selectors were looking for pictures that lent towards a new topographic style. So quiet villages became polluted by electric poles and filling stations. You might say that this style still dominates the genre of landscape photography today, perhaps with a little more humor and maybe a little more irony. I came across an exhibition put together by yet another Adams, this time Andy. He created FlakPhoto. I'll leave a link, so check it out if you haven't already discovered him. It's a great resource for articles and ideas on photography. Anyway, Andy Adams put together an exhibition called Looking at the Land for the Rhode Island School of Design in 2012. He did his own research, but also put out a general call to photographers. His curation is uncommonly merit-based, and for me this is an uncomplicated, sophisticated selection, and it really reflects contemporary American landscape practices that emerged between 2000 and 2012. I'm going to run a selection of these images, but I just wanted to say thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.